Hello there, little masters, and welcome once again to the Prancing Pony Podcast, where today, here in the Common Room, we are off on an adventure with a wizard of Tolkien scholarship.
West Hall, my friends. I'm Shawn Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the man of the West, the Alf to my Smith, Alan Sisto.
Oh, I like that one, sir. That's much better than, what was it the last time, the knob to your bob or whatever?
Something far less flattering. Well, you had the first two letters locked down on this one, so it was easy.
It was easy. Folks, today we are very excited to be welcoming Professor Verlyn Flieger to the podcast. Dr. Flieger is Professor Emerita in the Department of English at the University of Maryland, College Park, and a living legend among Tolkien scholars. She's the author of a bunch of critical books on Tolkien's work, the co-editor of the annual Tolkien Studies journal, and she has edited several of Tolkien's own stories and essays for publication, some of which we'll talk about today. I should also add one more thing. She has the patience of a saint. This is actually our second attempt at this interview, but we were stymied by some technical issues last time.
As does sometimes happen.
Mm-hmm.
I should also add, Alan, she's also a fantasy novelist. And
That's right.
She has so far been an absolutely wonderful person to talk to.
Absolutely.
And I can't wait to get right into it. We're so thrilled to have her here today. So, Dr. Verlyn Flieger, let me be the first to say welcome to the Prancing Pony Podcast.
Thank you, and hello.
Welcome.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Yes.
And we will go ahead and just start right into the questions here.
Best place to start.
Right at the beginning, that's right.
Absolutely.
And we always like to start with a little getting to know you questions. So would you mind telling us when and how you first discovered Tolkien's work? And at what point did you start approaching his work as a scholar as opposed to just being a fan?
That is a story often told. I first read The Lord of the Rings in, I think it was the winter of 1956, 1957. Anyway, it had just come out in England, and I was working at the Folger Shakespeare Library with a woman who was British and had been sent this wonderful novel by her brother, who was still living in the UK. It was a remarkable experience, and one that you cannot have anymore because we didn't know what we were reading. Nobody had ever heard of Tolkien. The book had no critical background to it. It just hit us like a ton of bricks. So that was my first experience. None at all. And I was blown away. Yeah. Now, when I started thinking about looking at it from a critical or scholarly point of view was when my 8-year-old son had poison ivy. Because at that time, his face was swollen to the size of a soccer ball, and he couldn't read, he couldn't play, he couldn't watch television, he couldn't do anything. And in a desperate attempt to keep him amused, I reached for a book, opened it up, and began the first sentence, when Mr. Bilbo Baggins of Bag End, Hobbiton, decided to celebrate his 111st birthday. And we were off. I reread the whole book to my older son and to my 2 younger kids at the same time, and they loved it. And I was in graduate school and teaching sort of teaching assistant type lower division courses. And I thought, this was the 70s, these students would love a course in fantasy. Maybe I could sneak in The Lord of the Rings. So I did, and I did.
Yeah.
And that's how I got started.
Wow.
That's wonderful.
Those students were more fortunate than they might possibly have known.
I know.
Oh, can you imagine, Shawn? Back in the 70s, I was in an undergrad, and I took a class from, I don't know, what was her name again? Dr. Flieger, I think it was, and on Lord of the Rings. What an amazing
that would have been. I remember how hard, there might have been one fantasy course offered at my school when I was in undergrad in the 90s. And, now I suppose such things are a little bit more common, but at the time it had to just be groundbreaking. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. And thank you for all you did to get it out there into the scholarly sphere.
Yeah, you really kickstarted that.
Believe me, it was fun.
As it should be. Speaking of fun, we understand you recently returned from Oxford, where you attended the opening of the exhibition at the Bodleian Libraries, Tolkien, Maker of Middle-earth. And you got to take part in a panel discussion with one of our earlier guests, Dimitra Fimi. for the sake of all the folks listening who wish they could have been there, and that definitely includes us, tell us a lot about that experience, both about the exhibit itself and about the panel discussion a little bit.
The exhibit is wonderful. It brings together so much material. It's the collaboration of the two major repositories of Tolkien archives, the Bodleian Library, which has most of the stuff, and Marquette University Library, which was fortunate enough to buy at a bargain price the manuscript of The Lord of the Rings many, many years ago. So they have The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, a number of letters, and the two libraries have exchanged copies with each other and cooperated, particularly in this exhibit, which is therefore a mine of material. Everything from Tolkien's chair, contributed by his daughter Priscilla Tolkien, a collection of his pipes, a number of early letters which are deeply moving, the original handwritten copy by Tolkien's wife Edith of the Book of Lost Tales, all the early paintings that were illustrations of The Hobbit, Tolkien's notes and jottings, things like hobbit measures, how many hobbit toes equal a foot. Just an extraordinary range of materials.
My goodness.
That sounds incredible.
It's something we've encouraged our listeners to try to attend. Of course, we're looking at possibly attending ourselves when it comes to the United States, I believe early next year.
To the Morgan Library.
Yes, to the Morgan Library. Thank you.
Well, it's a lovely experience, not just because you see all these wonderful things, but because you're among friends. Everybody is there because they've read the same book that you have read.
Yeah,
that is
true.
And
everybody is talking to everybody else, exchanging opinions, making friends. It's a really special experience, I would say.
I bet it is.
I don't doubt it. I mean, that has been one of our experiences just doing this podcast and connecting with Tolkien fans all over the world.
Yeah, the Tolkien community is amazing. Truly is.
It really is. It really is. And everywhere you go, you're among friends.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little bit, if you will, about that panel discussion that you were on. I know you got to be a part of that, and we'd love to hear about it.
That was several days after the opening of the exhibit on, I think, Tuesday, the 5th of June. And it was a panel organized by the Bodleian, including Dame Marina Warner, who has published a number of books on mythology, Dimitra Fimi, who's been on your podcast, and myself. Marina Warner was there to talk about myth in general. She's not a Tolkien scholar, but she is certainly a myth scholar. Dimitra Fimi was there because she has published on Tolkien and fairy stories, and she is kind of a specialist in that very specialized area. And I was sort of the one in the middle talking about Tolkien himself.
Oh, wow.
And myth and language, which is my baby.
Yes. As anybody who's read your works would quickly discover.
Absolutely.
Well, we had some interesting questions. Well, it was a self-selected audience, as you might suppose. Everybody was there because they had read the same book and they had read it multiple times and they all had opinions about it that they wanted to share. So the questions were very good, very to the point. The exchanges were very lively. There wasn't always agreement, but that led to discussion, and that was interesting. So I'd say we had a very good time. I believe that the Bodleian is going to have a podcast of that panel.
Oh, great.
I haven't heard any more details about it, and I've looked it up and can't find it on their website, but I believe it is coming.
Good. That's good.
Oh, that's great to know. We'll have to look for that.
When it releases, we'll have to promote that from our page as well and link to it and all that.
Absolutely.
That'd be great.
Great. Well, on that note, I think let's go ahead and talk about some of your written work. And I want to start with your latest book, which is a collection of essays titled There Would Always Be a Fairy Tale. In the introduction to that book, you wrote that Well, I guess I should back up and say that the book is just a collection of essays on a variety of topics. But in the introduction, you said that as you were putting those essays together, a more coherent picture than you'd anticipated began to emerge of Tolkien. And you described Tolkien as, and I love this phrase, a man as complicated as the books that bear his name. And I love that phrase. I know you focused on this aspect of Tolkien in many of your works before. Going back to Splintered Light, I know you started Splintered Light with a reference to Humphrey Carpenter's biography and that description of Tolkien as a man of antitheses. Could you tell us a little bit about Tolkien the man and these complications, these antitheses, and why is it important for us as readers to know about them?
Ooh, where to start? First, let me begin with a qualification. I really am not qualified to talk about Tolkien the man. I never met him. I wish I had. I feel that I know him, but of course I don't. I can talk about his work and what his works seem to have said to me. And I see them as being produced out of the tension between the antitheses that Carpenter talks about, that he was a jolly fellow who loved conversation, was very convivial, liked jokes, and the sort of dark side, probably deriving from his early childhood when he was orphaned. In which he felt that nothing really good would ever last. And if you look carefully at The Lord of the Rings, you will find any number of sort of almost asides that characters are wont to say about whether things will last. Theoden says it, Gandalf says it, maybe much that is beautiful will pass forever. Out of Middle-earth. And that was for me the bottom line with Tolkien. It's beautiful, it's precious. Good word. It's not going to last.
A little bit of that idea of the long defeat.
Yes.
That Galadriel talks about.
Yes.
That we can defeat evil for today, but we're still fighting the long defeat.
And always will, as long as we live in what Tolkien knew as a fallen world. It's never going to be perfect. We can try, and we must. And that's what the Lord of the Rings is for me. Is everybody trying so hard?
Indeed, absolutely. Artem Ard. Until the end of that, and I'm sure that's, like you said, stems from real world experiences in what is also a fallen world.
Well, but he also had a great capacity for enjoyment that comes out of his darker knowledge that nothing is going to last. You better enjoy it while you can.
Enjoy it.
And that's what the hobbits do. They like hot baths. They like mushrooms. They like bread and cheese. They like beer. They like songs. They like comradeship.
Enjoying life.
The simple pleasures, the truly simple pleasures in many ways. The ones that we would all do better to enjoy more of and more frequently.
If we had a chance, take it while you can.
Absolutely.
It's like Thorin says to Bilbo on his deathbed.
Oh, yeah.
If more of us valued, what is it?
Food and cheer.
Over hoarded gold.
Over hoarded gold. Yeah.
That was a really poignant moment.
Yes, I love that.
Yeah, truly is.
I really can't think of it without crying.
Yeah.
Or read it to my kids.
Yeah. We recently read that in the podcast. I got to the privilege of reading that. By that, I mean I beat Shawn over the head until he let me take that passage. And it was hard to get through it without tears, and I'd practiced.
There was an exchange of passages. There was a little hostage exchange.
I give Shawn more poetry. He lets me take more of those character moments.
Well, it is hard to get through. And that's because it's, spot on. That's what it is.
Absolutely.
It is.
It touches at the very core. I mean, it just drills down deep past all of those layers, and you realize that there's such truth in that. And we have to recognize it before we're on our deathbed if we're going to enjoy what life has to offer.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, on the topic of antitheses, there's an essay in the collection called Eucatastrophe in the Dark. in which you explain that when you teach Tolkien to college students, you always do so through the lens of two essays on fairy stories, which we've used as well, and Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics. Now, you've called these two essays in a couple of places the keys to the mythology. It's also the early foundation in Splintered Light, which we'll be getting to in a little bit. But a lot of our readers definitely can understand that applicability of on fairy stories. Certainly our listeners can. We've talked about it a lot. Our whole first episode was on it.
Mm-hmm. All the way back to the beginning.
Exactly. And please don't listen to it now. It's embarrassing. We were still getting our feet under us.
We were a little rough. We were just starting out.
But, the content was there. But I suspect the Beowulf essay is not as widely read. And I, plead guilty to not bringing that in here yet, at least not yet. Now, maybe people think they need to have a firmer grasp of Beowulf itself, or maybe they just don't understand the applicability. But what are those readers, and maybe even us as hosts, missing out on by not spending more time with the Monsters and the Critics?
Ooh.
We don't ask the easy questions, do we?
You're missing out on a lot. Of course, many, many people have not read Beowulf. Nobody picks it up in the library just for fun. You have to take a course. You practically have to be in graduate school and trying to translate.
Yeah.
But it is the bedrock of Tolkien's way of looking at things, as well as the bedrock of Beowulf scholarship, because it really changed the whole field when it was first published. Ideally, you should, well, I can't say read Beowulf, but if you could, you should read the essay.
Yeah.
Then you should read Beowulf. Then you should read the essay again. And then you should read Beowulf again. And then you should read The Lord of the Rings.
There you go.
Now, that's a tall assignment.
It is. Shawn, how do you think we're going to fit that into?
That's a fun summer read.
Right. Take it to the beach.
I was going to say, how are we going to fit that into season 3? Do we start? Folks, I know you're expecting us to start with Fellowship of the Ring, but we're going to start with Beowulf. I think we might just have to do that.
Well, I used to say to my classes, my classes on Tolkien, if I could only teach one book in this course, it would be Beowulf.
Wow.
Because if I did it right and you got it, you could read The Lord of the Rings on your own.
We might have to,
Because Beowulf is about a man who tried and failed.
Yes.
And that is what The Lord of the Rings is about.
That's an often overlooked point about Frodo, is the fact that he failed in his quest.
Yeah.
Yes, and that was for Tolkien so important.
Yeah.
Because of course he had to. It's set up that way. You can't possibly give up the ring.
Right.
And as readers, we are told that almost from the very first page, certainly from the second chapter. You cannot.
When Gandalf tells him, you can't give away the ring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It can't be, or you can, and how did he say it? You cannot be made to give it up except by force.
Yeah. And it would break your mind.
Which would break your mind, yeah.
But you read the whole book and you go along with Frodo and you're going to Mount Doom and we're going to throw away the ring. And then when you get there and that awful, awful moment happens, you can't believe it. Now that's, again, difficult to do in these days when everybody knows the books and the movies. But I have to tell you, when that first happened to me in 1956, I was devastated.
Yeah.
Wow.
And then you get the fairy story essay aspect with the eucatastrophe, in which bang on top of that dreadful moment when Frodo falls, in comes Gollum, bites off his finger, falls into the pit with the ring, and Frodo is healed, and the world is saved. How?
Wow.
It takes some kind of writing to be able to do that. Tolkien was crying when he wrote it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, the eucatastrophe, when that turn comes, it will bring tears. That's one of the things he talks about in On Fairy Stories is that it's such a powerful emotional moment, and it resonates with us so deeply that don't be surprised to find that happening. And I know it happens even now after how many dozens of reads, those certain moments, that moment. There are other moments, I think, when Éomer turns and sees the black sails turn, and they become the sails of the King of Gondor. And even just now talking about it, I'm getting goosebumps all up and down my whole body.
Or the cock crow.
Oh, I know.
My goodness. I cannot wait for those moments. But yeah. Boy, and you're right. Those have more potency when they're viewed in the context or as of that antithesis between the dark and the eucatastrophe, between that knowledge that you're going to lose, but then the knowledge that there can be a eucatastrophe. Yeah.
Well, and Tolkien even says that you need the threat of discatastrophe for the eucatastrophe to have meaning.
It has to always be there. Yeah.
Well, you've got to have dark in order to appreciate light.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Which we'll talk more about
as you said quite well in the very beginning of Splintered Light. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've got to have light in order to fully grasp the meaning of dark.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well,
I mean, these are such simple things. You say that and you sort of think, duh.
Straightforward concept. It's
but it's those basics that underpin a lot of what we think and read.
That's certainly true.
And it's when you think of how well Tolkien weaves that into the story. Yeah. I mean, as you just said, Dr. Flieger, the idea that Tolkien does tell us right there in chapter 2 of book 1 that Frodo is not going to be able to give up the ring. And yet we go on that entire journey with him. And we hope all along that things are going to turn out just fine. And
we're
through all the
surprised
twists
when he
and
doesn't.
turns.
Yeah.
Right. We are shocked when he doesn't. Yeah.
I think I did more than hope. I think I expected.
Yeah.
Right.
Because
we've all read books before. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
He lured me along. He flim-flammed me. He conned me.
But masterfully.
And then he pulls the rug out from under you and you fall flat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the eucatastrophe comes,
devastating.
which is why it's so
Yeah.
That's why the eucatastrophe becomes so much more potent.
And I think it's an act of mercy that the eucatastrophe comes so quickly on the heels of that moment of failure, because otherwise it would just be devastating.
Yes, I think you're right.
But it's only devastating for a few paragraphs.
Yep, you couldn't take it. You couldn't take it for anything more. It's too intense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You are right.
Well, moving on, if I can ask one more question about the new book, there's an essay in there that I've really been looking forward to talking to you about, because this is the essay called, "But What Did He Really Mean?" And in that essay, you focus on the letters, and specifically the fact, which I don't think a lot of people are aware of or are consciously thinking of, the fact that Tolkien tailored his letters for the people to whom he was writing. Now,
as we all do, of course.
As we all do, that's true. And
just nobody puts together a book of all the emails I've ever sent, thank goodness.
Right. You don't get to line them up next to each other and compare notes. But we've had several guests on the show now, and a few of them, I'm thinking, what, Alan? I know John Garth and I think Michael Drought.
I was actually just re-listening to the interview with Professor Drought, and I just heard him say that exact thing.
Yeah, they both mentioned this idea to us, and they gave the credit to you, Dr. Flieger. So that's why we've been looking forward to talking to you about this. But basically, in a nutshell, your essay sort of warns us about the possibility of, or potential, I should say, for cherry picking those letters. You can basically cherry pick those letters for statements that support pretty much any belief or intention we want to ascribe to Tolkien. Mm-hmm. So my question for you about that is, in light of that, with that warning in mind, are the letters still valuable as a resource for study? And if so, how can we use them more wisely?
Yes, the letters are not just still valuable; they're unique. It's really all we have of Tolkien in his own voice. Now there's lots and lots of lecture notes still in the Bodleian, but those are notes; they're not direct statements. And the letters are Tolkien on Tolkien. And you can't do better than that. But I do think they have to be read with as much awareness as you can bring to them that he's talking to particular people. And we don't have the letters he's responding to.
That's a very good point.
So we're getting one half of the story. I think the only thing you can do with that knowledge is be very cautious about what you choose to take as the final word on just about anything. I mean, when Tolkien makes a declarative statement like Frodo failed, 2 words, that's from the horse's mouth. You can put your money on that. But when he says, as he did to a correspondent who compared Galadriel to the Virgin Mary,
right?
Yeah.
His reply was, "Oh, other people have pointed that out to me." And of course, the Virgin Mary means a great deal to me as a Catholic. But he never says, "Yeah, you're right." He kind of dances around it in a way that is encouraging and diplomatic.
Well, because the recipient of that letter was Father Robert Murray, right?
No, this was another reader.
Oh, okay.
And I can't remember her name now. I think it was a woman, but I'm not sure. But you got to remember also that he did know Robert Murray and know him well.
Yeah.
But in many of these letters, he's writing to complete strangers.
That's true. Yeah.
People he has never met and probably never will meet. So you have to be very careful with your words.
Maybe a little more of an arm's length conversation.
As any politician will tell you.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And I think you mentioned in the essay that he didn't want to get into a theological argument with people.
No.
Right.
No.
So he just sort of tiptoes around the issue, as you say.
I don't think he did. I think he wanted his story to have its own impact. Yeah. And he certainly didn't want to get into esoteric debate.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm grateful for that. I think that would have, I'm not sure it would have tainted the work per se, but I think it would have made people read it differently. And I think it's best that it stands on its own and people are able to form their own responses without being shoehorned into, how it has to fit this particular way or.
That hasn't stopped people.
No, it has not stopped people. You're right.
And we all have our own Tolkien, who is made in our image, in a sense,
true,
because we bring ourselves to everything we read.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's easy to see how the other guy has got it wrong. But you have to be very careful to remember that you're talking from your perspective.
Yeah,
right.
That's true.
Yeah. And it is very interesting that given how much Tolkien wanted his work to stand on its own and how often he attempted to say, oh, my biography isn't important to understanding my story. And yet, paradoxically, we all spend so much time learning about it because it still does manage to enrich the reading.
Yes,
it does.
I guess it's just being careful about how you use it. I guess that's really the message.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we should do that with all authors. We should do it with J.D. Salinger.
That's true.
Or Ernest Hemingway. Well, it's awful hard with Hemingway.
Yeah, that's true.
To divide his life from his work, but we should try.
Yeah, quite.
Because he wrote himself into his work so much.
Yeah.
As all authors do, I guess. But maybe Hemingway more consciously
and more intentionally, I suspect. But well, I want to shift gears just a little bit and spend a chunk of time here on Splintered Light, which I just finished another read through of it, and I'm blown away as I was the first time. We've talked about this book often, but frankly, not often enough on the show, and it's been really key to our understanding of the legendarium. So, on a personal note, thank you.
I would echo that. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
The first edition, of course, came out back in 1983. It must have been one of the first, if not the first, book, which focused primarily on the Silmarillion, since it had only been published 6 years earlier, in 1977. I'm curious, what first attracted you to the Silmarillion as a subject for closer study? And then how did you realize, and of course you were correct, that there was so much to be discovered there at a time when a lot of readers and critics, and I think you point that out in the introduction, we're still really unsure what to make of it because it was so radically different from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings.
So you're asking me what attracted me to the Silmarillion?
Yeah, what attracted you, and then what made you realize the volume of information there to be discovered when it seemed like nobody else really had a handle on the book because it was so different from the other works?
Well, what attracted me was the fact that it got published. I mean, we were all waiting to see if there was anything more by Tolkien. I think the Silmarillion was on the New York Times bestseller list for something like, I'm going to get this wrong, but something like 50 weeks.
Oh my goodness.
A long time.
Wow.
It also shows up more than any other book I have ever tracked in secondhand bookstores. Because so many people bought it, started to read it, found out it wasn't about hobbits. And gave it to the Goodwill.
Right. My goodness. What they missed out on.
And I was fascinated because it suddenly put a sort of long-distance lens on The Lord of the Rings, and I could see it in a much deeper perspective. That scene at Weathertop, where Aragorn says, I'm going to give you a little bit of this verse. You know, it's in translation, but here's the story. And then he starts talking about Beren and Luthien and the tale of Tinuviel. And in 1956, who knew?
Yeah.
For all I knew,
that was all you had at the time.
Beren and Luthien was something Strider had made up on the spot. And then you realize that it is the foundation story for the whole mythology. And everything sort of reorients itself. And you've got a bigger book, a richer book, a deeper book, a book with its own history. A lot of Tolkien wannabes have written trilogies. The Lord of the Rings is not one. In imitation of what they thought Tolkien was doing. You know, you get a magic artifact, you get a couple of words in italic, you get a journey, you get a map, you got it made. And I could name you some books that,
the formula.
that go a long way on that. But all that paraphernalia was, in a sense, generated on the spot. Whereas Tolkien's Silmarillion mythology had been going since 1917.
Yeah.
So he had it there, ready to hand.
Amazing.
And of course, he also wanted to sneak in as much of it as he could because he didn't think it would ever get published.
Yeah.
Right. I can't imagine what that must have felt like for him to spend his entire life working on it and not know if it would ever get published.
Yeah.
Well, there's where C.S. Lewis came in handy because Lewis believed in it. It was Tolkien's publishers who told him it was unpublishable.
Yeah.
When he sent it in and they said, what exactly is this?
What is this? I can't find any hobbits. I'm still looking. There aren't any.
Right.
Yeah. You know, it before, I know Shawn's got another question to follow up, but this made me think of a concept that Professor Drought talked to us about when we had him on back in, I think it was December. And that was the idea of textual ruins.
Yeah.
This notion that, you know, these beautiful pieces of history where you don't have any other context or placement. So things like that tale of Beren and Luthien at the top of Weathertop, or one of my favorite moments when Theoden charging down with the Rohirrim is compared to Orome.
Yeah.
Until 1977.
Bilbo's song about
Bilbo's song about Arendelle. Bilbo's song.
And Aragorn gives him grief for singing it. Yeah.
Well, if you have the cheek to sing a song about Arendelle in Elrond's house.
And you have no idea what that means until later on.
They're just textual ruins at that point, and they enrich the story. But then when you find out the real story, it makes it even more amazing. And it just makes your hunger for all of those other textual ruins become even richer and become even fuller. You start to read, no matter what little bits and pieces, in the Silmarillion, there are a bunch of them too, and you want to know more.
Well, you know what? Beowulf is full of that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Beowulf is full of ruins, textual ruins.
Yeah.
Other stories that get alluded to, names that get dropped. as if you're supposed to know who this is. And of course, no student in a graduate course with a Beowulf crib has any idea until you look it up in the index. But the original hearers probably had all of that.
They knew
in their collective memory.
Mm-hmm. They came to that story with that knowledge, didn't they? Because they had been hearing those stories all their lives.
Yeah.
And what Tolkien was trying to do was to create that very concept that, of course, you've been hearing these stories all your lives. And the genius is that the hobbits hadn't. The hobbits are really ignorant. They don't read.
Very sheltered.
They don't have maps that go beyond their borders. They're very insular, very parochial. Yeah. And so they're the perfect people for Tolkien to send out into the big wide world and have to learn about it.
That's an excellent insight. I know we've talked about, Shawn, the parochial nature of hobbits before and how, and even within the hobbit community, how they view somebody as, an outsider because they live, on the other side of the river. I mean,
those Bucklanders, those folks are weird because they live all the way over there.
And yet their world is so small in comparison to the rest of Middle Earth. But to use that as the perfect vehicle for demonstrating that concept and for bringing them into this world, this large world with a deep, long history.
Well, it's a good job they sent Sam and not Ted Sandyman.
Oh, goodness, yes.
Right, yeah.
Ted Sandyman wouldn't have lasted very long, I suspect.
Can you imagine?
It's a very good choice.
Yeah. That's actually, that's a really good segue into my next question, which is just to kind of let our listeners know that Splintered Light is not entirely about the Silmarillion.
No.
You do devote a few chapters at the end to Lord of the Rings, and especially how this theme of separation and fragmentation that spans the whole legendarium, really. And also the contrast between light and dark, which you've alluded to already in this interview, how it sort of reaches its final play in the Third Age with, hobbits, the smallest people, the smallest fragment, I believe you call Frodo. So we have just finished our read-through of The Hobbit, and we've spent a lot of time talking about the ways in which Bilbo illustrates the contrast of opposites, the Took versus Baggins, the archaic versus the modern, or at least the 19th century modern, the Victorian or Edwardian.
Very up to date.
Yeah, and I think we'll probably be discussing this a lot more when we get to Lord of the Rings, but what is it about hobbits, do you think, that makes them such a window into some of these themes that were so important to Tolkien? Is it just because they're more like us, or what is it that makes the hobbits illustrate that theme of fragmentation and those opposites so well?
A lot of things. They are more like us. They are little. They are overlooked. Nobody had written about hobbits, so Tolkien is free to make them what he wants. Everybody has some kind of preconceived idea of elves or dwarves, or even trolls. But nobody had a concept of hobbits before Tolkien came up with it, although the word did exist. And also, he makes them, I think, quite remarkably like the human community. They are, as we've said, insular, parochial, ignorant, bigoted, opinionated, prejudiced, full of their own ideas and not particularly interested in anybody else's, and very suspicious. So they are perfect to encounter and feel the impact of the big wide world. And they get it first with Tom Bombadil.
Boy, they do, don't they?
Because he takes them all the way back.
Right.
To when the dark was fearless, before Morgoth.
Yeah.
And that's a long way back, and nobody knew it in 1956.
Boy,
but
they didn't.
Their eyes are constantly being opened, not just to the world, but also to themselves. So that they come away from, all their adventures with some rather humbling new ideas or concepts of themselves when Bilbo Baggins grabs the Arkenstone and says, now I am a burglar indeed.
Yeah.
You realize that he's been playing all along.
Right.
He really didn't think he was a burglar, and he is.
He finally becomes one.
So there are moments that every small individual human being has to undergo, and I hope that everybody does, of self-realization, of self-knowledge, of suddenly having a light thrown on yourself in a way that makes you see yourself differently. And that's what light is for.
Yeah.
I don't know if I answered your question or not. I sort of got on a roll there.
I think you did.
You did very well, because you made me start thinking about on fairy stories and the idea of the hobbits entering a secondary world. I mean, we as the reader are entering a secondary world when we open the book.
Yeah.
But the hobbits are entering a kind of secondary world when they cross the borders of the Shire and enter into this Middle Earth that they don't really understand.
Yeah.
And that's very enchanted.
Beyond the scope of their, I'm not going to say, well, it really is actually beyond the scope of their imagination even. I mean, that's, and I think that's part of the point. You know, for us as readers, we're being taken into a world that is beyond what we might imagine.
Yes, and it's our own world.
Exactly.
Right.
That's exactly right.
And that takes a while to realize, but you can loop it right back to the hobbits who are, yes, going out into the big wide world, but at one point in the woods, just above Hobbiton, Frodo says to Gildor, can't a hobbit walk from his own shire to Bree in peace? And Gildor says, it's not your own shire. What do you think? Others were there before you, and people will be there after you.
That's right.
Right.
You know, the book is full of insights like that, and I love them.
Yeah.
There's so many nuggets. Oh.
And thinking of the Shire, and now all of a sudden I'm thinking of the Shire as that little circle of light in Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, and the big wide world as the darkness beyond it. Yeah. And how much the hobbits are going out into that.
Okay.
Maybe with a little less self-knowledge that, you know, I think the heroes in that mythical world, they know I'm about to go out into this darkness and I'm going to be beaten because that's what happens. I don't know that the hobbits quite knew that, but there's certainly some similarity there, isn't there?
But
I don't know if I have anything to say about it. I'm just thinking about it. It's a clear picture in my head.
His phrase about the little circle of light is just so spot on and so vivid, and at the same time so very quiet. But you know what you got to keep in mind? The ring is in the Shire. So it ain't all light.
No.
Right.
Right at the
there
very
is that
heart
darkness
of it,
there.
Is this very dark principle. And they don't know it.
No. Well, they don't know a lot of things. That's
right. That's true.
We find that to be the case for the hobbits. Their lack of knowledge, willing or otherwise. But yeah.
But once again, that interplay of those opposites really, again, as you said a moment ago, Dr. Flieger, and as you say in the book, Splintered Light, how the light and the dark define each other, and these contrasts throughout the legendarium define each other. Fate and free will, hope and despair. I can't remember.
We've spent so much time on those, haven't we?
We have. We really have.
Well, and even in The Hobbit, the smaller, more obvious themes like comfort and discomfort, you know, that we see in Hobbit, we see Bilbo in those moments that are where he's craving comfort because he's in a moment that's highly uncomfortable. Yeah.
Or Tookish versus Bagginsy.
Yeah, the Took-Baggins conflict.
And how much time and ink did we spend on Turin Turambar and Fate and Free Will, you know?
what a character. I love him.
Yes. I mean, 3 episodes in 7 hours, and yet we're still planning on doing the Children of Hurin separately when we complete The Lord of the Rings at some point.
Oh, wonderful. You got to let me know when you do. I want to listen.
It'll probably be about 5 years from now, I think.
Okay.
Well, we're just looking at how long The Lord of the Rings is going to take us. We did some math, and I won't bore you or our listeners with all the details, but our current pace was something like about 7.5 pages per hour of discussion just for The Hobbit. The Silmarillion was probably a little bit slower than that, and I figure The Lord of the Rings will probably be closer to the Silmarillion pace than the Hobbit pace. That puts us at probably, what did we figure, Shawn? We're probably talking about 250 episodes. That's about 5 years before we'll be done with The Lord of the Rings.
Yep.
Good luck.
So it's, yeah, thank you. We'll need it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, goodness.
And by the time we're done with that, we'll be so good at podcasting, we're going to want to go back and do the Silmarillion again.
Seriously. I have listened to some of those older episodes, and they're interesting, but I do wish that, I don't know, somehow I wish we tackled a year of experience before we'd done it, but how could you do that? You got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, Shawn, I think you said you had a follow-up question on that, right? It wasn't in our notes initially, but I want to make sure you get a chance to ask it.
Oh, it was really just about the interplay of the opposites.
Okay.
The light and the darkness, fate and free will. So I think we've talked about it.
Okay. Boy, fate and free will. Yeah, there's another one. And some great ink spilled on that in Splintered Light as well, as I recall. So in addition to your own books and essays, Dr. Flieger, you've edited some critical editions of Tolkien's own works. You recently, The Story of Kullervo and the lay of, I still think I'm going to mispronounce this every time, but I think I manage it, Autru and Atrun.
You did it right.
Yay! I don't always get those things right, but it's a beautiful language. I want to get it right. Now, these are, of course, both early, very early, in one case, writings of Tolkien's that represent early takes on themes that he would tackle later on in his more popular works. What advice would you give to someone who wants to read those works for further insight into the legendarium works, the Silmarillion, the Lord of the Rings? What should they keep in mind? And is there anything that they should be careful of in using those works to understand the legendarium?
Wow. No. Just read them.
There you go.
You don't need to keep Tolkien in mind when you read Autru and Atrun or The Story of Kullervo, because you cannot possibly not think about the other things of his that you have read and how these might weave themselves into the larger tapestry. So just read them, enjoy them. I think they're both really, really interesting for the dark qualities that they bring to this very young man, because these are the earliest, especially with The Story of Kullervo, sometime between 1912 and 1916.
Very young man.
A very young man. And he is so powerfully drawn to this terrible story of this angry, resentful misfit who doesn't like anybody and hates the world. And you think, where is this coming from? Okay, it's coming from Kalevala, which is Finnish mythology. Yeah. So it's pre-existing in a way. Tolkien is adapting the story. But why this one? Out of all the stories that mythology is crammed with. Something drew him.
Yeah, why is that the one that resonated?
To this angry young man.
Yeah. And at the same time, that was the young man who wrote the first version of I can't remember the name of the poem now, but the Voyage of Eärendil, the Evening
one that
Star.
would become Errantry, but the predecessor to it.
Well, there you go, and it's the same binary that we've been talking about. Light and dark.
That same set of antitheses. Yeah,
right. Wow, that's fascinating.
I mean, I suppose you could chalk some of that up to typical teenage angst, but
well, sure, it is typical teenage angst, but not many teenagers manage to achieve something like The Story of Kullervo.
No, that is
something
certainly
like
true.
Kullervo, for certain.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, Shawn, if they found what you wrote when you were, 14, it wouldn't have looked like that.
No, it wouldn't. No, it would not be.
But you could compare Kullervo. I'm not suggesting that you want to go out and do this right away, to Holden Caulfield, who's also very angry, who also feels the world doesn't understand him. And he doesn't understand the world. And J.D. Salinger was a man who suffered from post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
And you can find a lot of that in The Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can. That's true.
I think one of the things that we talk about a lot on this podcast, going back to Tolkien's allegory of the bones and the soup, or I guess Descent's allegory technically, but
and his Tolkien adaptation of that,
for his own, allegory, his adaptation for his use. But we talk about the fact that it's fun to look at the bones. We love looking at the bones, but what's always most interesting to us is what makes it different. And so it's seeing those changes between the angry young man of Kullervo, written by an angry young man, and then you take something like The Children of Húrin, which is an angry young man written by an older, wiser man, and it's so fascinating to see how Tolkien grows in his perception of that character.
Oh, could you tell me some more about that? That's really interesting.
You're on the spot, Shawn.
I'm wishing I hadn't said anything now. No, I feel that I don't know. I feel that Tolkien's later version of Turin, he's viewing Turin later on with a bit more. I don't know if judgment is the right word, but I think he's definitely
discernment,
sort of
maybe perspective.
Maybe discernment. Perspective. He's viewing Turin's anger and his bad decisions from some distance, and that distance kind of helps us keep it in perspective. Whereas with Kullervo, I felt like I was just right there with him, and it was a much harder, much more painful story to read, even as fragmentary as it was.
Yeah,
I don't know if that makes any sense, but
I think it makes excellent sense. Yeah.
And now you know why I asked Shawn to join the podcast. Oh goodness,
I do try.
No, you do. That was really good. I same kind of thing that we talked about actually a little bit when we did Children of Húrin. And we compared Kullervo a little bit, and we compared the early drafts of Turin and the novel version, which was, of course, adapted from the Narn and all these other sources. But, kind of seeing that development of the way the character of Turin was shaped. I think, Shawn, you've got the next question, don't you?
I think I do. So we've been talking about early Tolkien, his first major work. Now I want to go straight to the other bookend of his career and talk about his last major work, because not only did you edit Kullervo and Outru and Atrun, but you also did a critical edition of Smith of Wootton Major. And Dr. Flieger, you've written a lot about Smith. I've read as much of it as I could because I love Smith. It's my favorite non-legendarium story. But there's a couple of things that I think are interesting that you've said. Not only have you argued against the idea of an allegorical interpretation, which another noted Tolkien scholar has put forth,
who will be appearing on this show,
who will be on this show soon, and we've read that article, that point counterpoint article, which was great. But you've also offered the idea that Smith is, I think your words were, a realization of the theoretical concept presented in On Fairy Stories. So I think, just sort of echoing Alan's question about the early works, what advice do you have for somebody who's wanting to find insight into the legendarium from reading Smith of Wootton Major? And is there anything we should be careful about there? Or is it, once again, no, just read it and enjoy it and,
Well, first of all, for sure, read it and enjoy it. I don't think you should have to be careful. I don't know what you'd be careful of. In many ways, it is Tolkien's most extreme statement of the very important concept to him of Faërie, of the other world. He just puts it out there and says, okay, take it or leave it. And Smith has to take it and leave it. But it's uncompromising. It doesn't explain.
No.
It doesn't condescend. It doesn't sympathize. It just is. And it's beautiful and dangerous and tough. And in a sense, I can't say inaccessible because Smith goes there. But
true.
I'm trying to think of a word. Inapproachable in a way because you can't get hold of it.
Right. Yeah. He has it. He has access to it for a time. He has that passport. I think you called the star. The passport to Faërie. And he's able to go there for a time, and he
Right.
He seems to travel freely. He doesn't seem to have the difficulty that somebody like an Eärendil has, or anybody in the legendarium of crossing on the straight road.
Crossing into Faërie.
No, there's no geography, and there's no special way to get to Faërie. I mean, in The Lord of the Rings, the hobbits have to go down a tunnel, through a gate, in a forest, just one transition after another, crossing water, going underground into the underworld. And in Smith of Wootton Major, he kind of just chucks all that aside and says, Smith goes into Faërie and he's gone. You never know for how long, whether it's a day, a week, a year, he doesn't know. And it's Tolkien's, I think, last and most honest effort to describe something that was probably indescribable. And that is the altered state, that the deep experience of imagination can produce. In the fairy story essay, he calls it Faërian drama.
Yeah.
Yes.
And he says, if you've been in a Faërian drama, you will know it because the potion is too strong and you believe that it's real. It's very, very dangerous to read biography into what people write, especially about themselves. But I kind of have the feeling that Tolkien knew what he was talking about, that he'd been there.
Yeah. That he'd felt that reality of...
And that he realized that he had to come home.
He had to leave it behind at some point.
Yeah.
There was that friend of his who said, what was the quote that one of his friends said to him? You really broke through, didn't you?
That's a great one.
Simone Dardenne.
Yeah.
Right.
She was one of his students, one of his graduate students. Yeah, you broke through the veil.
Broke through the
and
veil.
Got to the other side. Ooh, that's about as far out as you could get if you take it seriously. And she says he readily admitted it.
Yes.
Yeah.
But in Faërian drama, in the fairy story essay, he says, you are in a dream that some other mind is weaving.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm just going to leave that alone.
And that's a tough concept in that essay because he doesn't really explain that concept very much in the essay.
No.
But I think you've done a really good job in some of your essays. I think in the new book and in some of your other writings to really get to the heart of what that Faërian drama is.
As much as I can. I think it's finally unapproachable.
Yeah.
I probably would know it when I saw it.
There you go. It's maybe undefinable in a way that you couldn't define it to somebody who hadn't also experienced it.
But a lot of people could have experienced something like it. I don't know about the two of you, but anybody who's done any kind of writing for pleasure, writing of fiction, has had the experience of having the story take on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And then you just follow where it goes, and you're really hanging out with all these neat people who you didn't know you knew, and letting them take you where they will. That's the function of imagination, but it doesn't feel like it. It feels like you are in a dream that some other mind is weaving.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the beauty of being able to write it down and share it with somebody and share all these people and all this imagination with others. Just as
I agree.
Again, I'm thinking of Smith and the way he comes back and he sings while he works after visiting
I agree,
Faërie.
and he makes beautiful things.
Yes. Yes, he does. Well, I think we probably have a few more questions. You've done such a great job of staying on point. We're so used to Corey Olsen and Professor Drought, who, like us, digress.
They have broader minds.
This has been great. We've gotten through a lot of questions. It's been great.
We have. Many of our listeners know you as one of the co-editors of the journal Tolkien Studies, along with Michael Drought and now David Bratman, though previously Douglas Anderson. We had Professor Drought on the show a few months back and talked to him a little bit about how the journal came into existence. Can you tell us or our listeners a little bit about how you got involved with it and kind of what maybe what the future is for Tolkien Studies going forward?
Well, I can certainly tell you how I got involved because it's very simple. I was invited by Mike Drought
well,
and Doug Anderson, and I jumped at the chance.
Of course.
They thought it was time for a journal on Tolkien Studies. I couldn't have agreed more, and the idea that I would get to work with them in the startup of something like that was just too good to pass up.
Mm-hmm.
What's that been like? What do you feel about the world of Tolkien Studies today as you're reading these papers and reading about some of the different research and some of the different ideas that are out there?
Well, I think we've found I don't know how to put this without sounding like it's going to be blowing our own horn, but I think we've found a whole world of scholarly, informed, exciting people out there. And I hope that we've given them a venue for the things they want to say, because I think we've published some terrific stuff.
Mm-hmm. You do.
I'm very proud of it.
Mm-hmm.
And we hoped that those people were there, but we didn't know them all. And the fact that they were there, that they came forward, that they produced stuff, that they wrote things that astonished us, that we'd never thought of, was one of the most exhilarating experiences I've ever had. And I think that Doug would say the same thing, Mike would say the same thing, David would say the same thing.
Very good.
There seems to be a sense from the folks we've talked to, wouldn't you say, Alan? Talking to Professor Drought or
sure.
Professor Olson, there's an interesting tone to Tolkien scholarship that's a little different from other types of academic scholarship.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's not just scholarly, but it's also nerdy or geeky.
Yeah, where that precision matters. I think Professor Drought talked about that in detail about the and how you can't just be this, having a great critical analysis of something. You have to get the Tolkien part right. You can't.
Right.
There's a nerd focus, and I mean that in the most complimentary way possible.
Oh, it's absolutely a compliment when we say it. Yeah.
You got to be right.
Yeah.
and then you can have your analysis. But yeah,
we've even experienced that as
very much so.
We make no pretensions to knowing what we're talking about,
no.
But at the same time, when we do say we will be called on it if we say something that's factually
and we get
wrong.
called on things.
That's very healthy, I think, to have that community out there.
Oh, very.
And know that you're going to be called on things, and know that you've got to get it right.
Yeah, we can't get away with just making stuff up as we go, which sometimes is what we do.
Right, we do sometimes.
We have our outlines and we stick to them, but sometimes we'll go off on a tangent and then I'll say something that wait a minute, that had no basis in reality whatsoever.
And suddenly we find ourselves talking about some other incident that happened in the Second Age where it's really hard to find anything, and you bring something up and I don't know where that is. I don't have my books.
I know.
I don't have all my books right here.
Do you guys read all those books? Have you read clear through the history of Middle-earth? I
believe, Shawn, you have.
I have not.
No, you have not? Okay.
I have not all the way through. No, I've started. I got as far as about the fifth one, through most of the Lost Road, but I have not read the Lord of the Rings ones all the way through.
Those are the ones I did read.
Oh, they're fascinating. Yes.
And then the later ones, when he goes back to the Silmarillion, I think I've probably read just about everything in there, just piecemeal.
We've read a lot piecemeal because as we went through the Silmarillion, we were pulling things from Laws and Customs of the Eldar was one of our go-tos. I remember we spent probably 20 minutes on a sidebar about the statute of Finwë and Miriel.
Yeah.
And that's fun stuff. But I think we'll probably, I know I'm going to give myself a refresher on the history of the Lord of the Rings before we get into.
The history of the Lord of the Rings is fascinating, deeply revealing, if revelation can be deep, because for me, as a sort of fledgling writer of fiction, it was comforting to know how many times he got it wrong. before he got it right.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
How many times he had to say, this is not working, go back to the beginning, start all over again, say, no, of course he wouldn't get married. And no, this is not his name. I mean, how could he go all the way through the first draft of The Lord of the Rings calling Strider Trotter?
Yeah, that's who I was thinking. Trotter.
A brown, and to start with a brown-faced hobbit named Trotter.
Well, I think I found out why, by the way. I stumbled across the name Trotter in a completely different reference, and it opened my eyes.
Very interesting.
I always thought of Trotter as kind of cute. I think of pigs trotting around, sheep trotting around, little kids trotting around, whereas Strider really, moves out. He
long shanks, long legs.
With a purpose.
But Trotter is one of the surnames of the English-Scottish border in the turbulent 16th century when they were at each other's throats and rustling cattle and burning barns and abducting people. And most of the names are really familiar in a way. The Nixons, the Grahams, a lot of American names that you probably know pretty well. But Trotter is one of the surnames. And that suggested to me that Tolkien might have been thinking of a completely different background for this character, that he was kind of a guerrilla fighter, that he was a raider, that he operated outside society in a way.
Right.
And I had never thought of the name Trotter in those terms. It was very humbling.
Wow.
That's fascinating.
That does cast a different light
There's
on it,
a terrific book called The Steel Bonnets by a man named MacDonald. I'm pretty sure it's MacDonald, which is a history of those years along the English-Scottish border. And the end papers had a map, and that's where I found the name Trotter.
Wow. And yes, it is George MacDonald Fraser is the author of The Steel Bonnets, the story of
Have you read it?
Anglo-Scottish border. I have not read it. I'm looking it up because I wanted to make sure our readers would get a chance. But
thank you for that,
I love history, and this is a time of history that fascinates me. So I'll probably be putting that on my relatively short to read list.
It's great. It's entirely readable. It's fascinating. It's full of bloody encounters and double dealing and double crossing and all kinds of good stuff.
Sounds fun.
It's it's just always so amazing to see the sources that Tolkien worked with.
Well, really I'm not saying that I know this was a source.
No.
First of all, The Steel Bonnets was written after he died.
Well, right.
But the history that it talks about was one that I think any educated Englishman would have been familiar with.
Right.
Certainly.
Right.
That's just
great. Yeah.
Now I'm really that's another book to add.
That's very cool. Along with rereading the entire history of Middle Earth and going front to back.
At least the middle volumes there that are doing with the history of the Lord of the Rings.
Come on, do Sauron Defeated.
Oh, Sauron I want to read that one all the way through. Actually, if I can just give a little plug to one of your other books, A Question of Time. I really want to read through all of the Notion Club papers now.
Well, yes, you haven't talked at all about the Notion Club papers.
No, we haven't.
And it's a wonderful sort of, not a sidebar exactly, but a different angle on Tolkien's feigned history. I think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
It starts really with the book that you said you ended your reading with, which is The Lost Road.
The Lost Road,
because that's where he first started talking or writing about time travel.
Right.
Yeah. And I think we've touched on it once or twice, just like mentioned it.
I think we've talked a little bit about some of the
places.
I know we've talked about some of the Adonaic stuff that's in there,
right?
Just with the linguistics of it.
I remember when it came up recently. It came up when we were having that discussion about the ability to hear languages and understand them, and how that would be genetically transferred.
That's right.
That's what it came up, was the conversation about how did Bard understand the thrush,
the language of the thrush, right?
And genetic transmission of language seemed utterly ridiculous, but then the notion of having a language embedded in your brain while you sleep, that also works. Why not?
Was something that Tolkien played with. Yeah,
he did more than play with it. He believed it.
Yeah, he did.
He really did. Have you guys run across an essay that he wrote? It's in a book called Angles and Britons on English and Welsh. He talks about a native language as being not the one you grew up with, but the one you were born with.
Oh, that's right. I have read that.
That is right.
Yes, that's
the one
right.
you were born with. That's true. Yeah.
So he
He did definitely.
See, and we didn't even think about that when we were discussing that.
I can't believe I didn't think of that when we were having that discussion about genetic transmission of language and how in the world does Bard understand thrush. But
he writes about it also to Christopher in the letters and to W.H. Auden. His letters to Auden are very interesting.
Well, I think it was in the Auden letter that he talks about having is that where he talks about having a natural predilection for the West Midlands dialect?
Yes, and isn't that where he says it's as good a genetic marker as blood groups?
Oh, right. Okay.
Oh my goodness. Your memory is astounding, because I remember that now, but of course, as we're in the midst of that discussion in The Hobbit, I did not remember it.
Well, check me. I don't have the book in front of me, but it's in there somewhere.
Well, I think that's right. I think that sounds right.
I happen to be pulling up my ebook version now just to see, because that's the kind of person I am.
That's what you have in the electronic age. You can't say anything anymore. Somebody's going to pull out an iPhone and check you.
Somebody can always prove you wrong or right so easily.
Yeah. Yep. We'll have to find.
They don't even have to know. They can just search it.
Well, I will tell you this, that I much prefer reading a book. Much prefer reading a book.
Oh, absolutely.
But for things like the letters, it is so handy to have an electronic version to search for, particular moments in the letters, because the index isn't particularly effective. Let's put it that way. So,
even
being able to have that
one
searching
with Hammond and Skull, which is much better than the original one.
Much better, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would be, an electronic copy would be super helpful.
But to be able to do a word search is electronic.
Because every once in a while you remember the phrase that he said, and you're trying to remember where was that phrase, because he had such a way with words that's what sticks in your head sometimes. So you don't know how to look it up in the index.
Yeah, that's true.
How did you guys come to Tolkien?
Wow. Shawn, do you want me to let you answer that one first?
Sure. Yeah. I had been a fantasy fan and a mythology fan all my life. But I mean, probably from early childhood, I read a lot of Greek mythology and a little bit of Norse mythology, read a lot of, played Dungeons and Dragons and, read a lot of that kind of fantasy. It was when I was a teenager, I think I was 15 or 16, I was reading a biography of my favorite band, my favorite rock band. And there was a mention of the story about Tolkien getting bored one day and writing "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit" on a paper. And I read that story and I thought, wow, this is amazing. What a cool act of creative rebellion to be bored at your job and write the first sentence of a story that kickstarts an entire world. Yeah. And I didn't realize, of course, at the time that
the world had already been kickstarted. Yeah, exactly.
Right. But it was reading that in a completely unrelated book that made me say, I have to go out and read these books. And I did. And I dove in and I've been there ever since.
Yeah. That's amazing. I started a little bit earlier, but I think I moved in a little bit slower. I was given a copy of an illustrated Hobbit. It was illustrated with the still frames from the animation of the Rankin and Bass movie that had come out in 77, I think that was. I think I got the book for my 10th birthday, which would have, or no, it was Christmas. So it was late 1978. I got that book, read The Hobbit, devoured it, loved it. And I don't know, though, that I knew about anything after that. I didn't know the other things existed right away. until I was able to talk to somebody about it, I think as a freshman in high school, so probably about 3 years later, I was telling a friend about this story. And, oh, you'd love this then. And so I picked up I picked up a box of the trilogy. I'm sorry. Sometimes I slip.
Bite your tongue.
I know. I was like, oh,
the single book divided
I will be
into
editing
3.
that. I bought a box set of 3 books. And I read and I read and I read and I devoured and I read, and I couldn't stop reading. I would read it and then I would reread it. And I just fell in love with the richness of the world, the fullness of it, how everything just seemed so well realized, so brought into being. I was astounded at his masterful use of language. I think that's the thing that stuck with me more than anything. I was a fairly sharp kid in high school. I was always felt like I was reading things that were ahead of what other people were reading, kind of like you, Shawn, Greek mythology in high school, that. And I knew I was a nerd for reading this, but hey, guess what? I knew I was already a nerd anyway, so it didn't matter.
Right. Yeah.
And I just fell in love with how rich the English language really was. And I just kept reading, and of course read it every year. Then I think I read the Silmarillion for the first time when I was 19, and it just blew me away. I've never really stopped since.
See, you were older than I was.
A little older
for the
when I had the Silmarillion, yeah. And I'm glad I was.
Because I read the Silmarillion.
Because I don't know that I would have been ready for it at 14 or 15, but.
Oh, I read it and I didn't understand it. I mean, I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I knew that there was a whole mythology there, and I really loved exploring it, but I didn't grasp a lot of it.
It was rich. Some of my favorite moments, and I can't wait for my kids, just like I know you feel, Shawn, is for them to discover this world. I mean, I'm still in the middle of reading The Hobbit to my 6-year-old son, and my 4-year-old daughter, but he's the one paying attention. And we're just about in Lake Town now. And he just absolutely asks the right questions. And I'm so jealous of him getting to experience this world for the first time. It's such a memory.
Oh, that's lovely. And you're right. It's that first timeness.
Yeah.
That can only happen once.
You wish you could go back and recapture it.
You really do.
Know.
Yeah. And you can.
Yeah. Yeah. It is something you keep grasping at, and it just disappears because you always have those earlier memories, and it's impossible to forget them.
And they're rich. It's a wonderful experience to read it again. But that moment when it unfolds for the first time,
it is a totally different experience.
Yes.
What makes up for the fact that you can't go back and have that first experience again is the fact that there's so much to read that you can always go back and you can always go find something new.
Yes.
That's true.
I've still got some volumes of History of Middle-earth to discover. Once I get through with those, there's always reading every single back issue of Venyar Tengwar and Parma Eldo Amberon, the linguistic journals. There's so much stuff there. There's always something to dig deeper on.
For me, I actually like doing the experiencing that first time moment vicariously. When the films were said to be coming out, my wife had never read the books. She knew I loved them. She knew about them, but she never read them. We sat down and did. I got a second copy, and so that she could read along while I read out loud the entire trilogy over a course of many, many weeks. And I never forget the tears streaming down her face when Gandalf fell in Moria. And in my heart, I'm like, I want to comfort her and tell her, don't worry, he's still alive. But of course I didn't. I didn't want to ruin that moment for her. No way. Right. But I will tell you this, when at the end of Two Towers, when Sam thinks Frodo is, just before the end of Two Towers, when Sam thinks Frodo's dead for a little bit before he realizes, he was just poisoned. My wife stopped me and said, you have to tell me right now. I will not read this anymore if you don't tell me. So I did have to ruin that one. But there is something joyous.
Only for a few pages, though.
Yeah. To relive that first time moment vicariously through a new listener, a new reader. And I think we've gotten so many comments from people, first time readers of the Silmarillion. I don't think we're going to get too many first time readers of the Lord of the Rings, but people who broke through finally and our podcast helped them. Man, that's been one of the highlights of the show, hasn't it been?
Yeah, it really has.
To get that
how many people got to finally made it through the Silmarillion and finally saw all this richness that we've been talking about, all that there was there to find.
Yeah. Wonderful.
And I'm glad we've had a chance to help some people with that.
Yeah, it's a real joy. It really is. Well, Shawn, I think you've got one more question.
I think we've got one more
now that
question
we've been
for
interviewed.
you, Dr. Flieger. Dr. Flieger, I think we'll try and close on this one. And I think it's a question that's on a lot of people's minds right now.
Yeah.
It seems like we're probably about to get a lot more Middle-earth in the media again. There's this Amazon series that everybody's talking about. There's a biographical film about Tolkien himself that's in the works. Probably more. I don't even know what else.
Yeah.
Do you think we can expect to see another surge of interest in Tolkien's work like we did back in 2001 with the Peter Jackson movies?
Or will we see it fizzle like we did, like after the the unspoken second set of movies?
Hobbit movies.
I think the work will endure.
Yes.
I don't know how the Amazon series will affect a reading public. I think the films have, again, I'm trying to think of the right word. I'm actually trying to think of a polite word for how the films have affected appreciation of the book, because they have entered into it.
They have.
Yeah.
It's true. There's no denying it.
People now, many people read the book in light of the films.
Yeah.
And that is bound to affect how you see, how your inner eye sees the book. You're going to see certain actors. You're going to see Elijah Wood or Kate Blanchett.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I believe so.
Right.
One of the smartest things a student ever said to me, and believe me, students have said some really smart things. I learn more from students than they learn from me. But right after the films came out, we were talking about them. I think it was just the first one. And we were talking about Gollum and Andy Serkis and computer-generated imagery.
CGI. Right.
And how that has sort of upped the ante for what you can do on screen. And Tolkien talks about that in the fairy stories, except he's talking about drama.
Right.
But we talked about Gollum, and one student, I said, how do you see Gollum now, after the films? And one student said, I don't see Gollum. I never saw Gollum. I hear him. And I thought, by gum, that's it exactly, because this is a whole tragic character captured by his speech patterns.
Right.
So that the one thing you know about Gollum is the way he talks.
Yeah.
More than you know it about Theoden, about Aragorn, who talks different from Strider.
Yes, he does.
Yeah, yeah.
But not in the way that you can immediately pick up on this warped, regressive, ancient, childish, infantile, self-absorbed creature who is I and we and Smeagol and Gollum and talks to himself and is so clearly of two minds. And Tolkien never tells you that.
He doesn't need to.
He just shows it to you.
Yep.
Right.
And you hear Gollum and you know everything you need to know.
Yeah.
And you hear the interplay of, I don't know if they're quite opposites, but they're definitely two opposing fragments in Gollum and Smeagol.
Oh yeah, when he says I, we, and he can't make up his mind.
Yeah.
It's pathetic.
Yeah, in a literal sense, the most literal sense it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. We could do a whole nother episode on the impact of the films, that's for sure. That's one of the reasons why I made my wife read the books with me before the movies came out, is I did not want her to read the books eventually and always see those characters, those actors, and those places. And
right.
And I'm glad that she did. because she had a much, much fuller experience, of course.
Well, we've talked about how it even affects us sometimes.
It does.
As many times as we read those books before the movies came out.
Yeah.
But now, I mean, I see Ian McKellen frequently when I think of Gandalf,
Thankfully, I didn't watch the Hobbit films enough, and so I don't have a problem seeing Thorin as the Thorin that I've always seen him as. But it is harder for characters like Gandalf, maybe Aragorn to some extent.
How about Frodo?
There are a few others. Frodo, I've been able to beat the large-eyed, doughy-eyed, Mr. Wood. I've been able to kind of get that out of my head.
Mainly just because Frodo in the books is written much older and wiser.
Yeah.
And so you can
there was more of a disconnect
different
in the first place for me between his portrayal and the book. And so it made it a little easier for me to kind of not picture him anymore. But it's Gollum. I can only hear Andy Serkis now. Every time I do read the lines.
Even when we read the lines, it's very hard not to do an Andy Serkis voice.
How do you not do it with a Serkis, try to do an impression of Andy Serkis?
Have you ever heard Tolkien read Gollum?
Yes. The Tolkien audio collection. I love that.
Yes.
It's wonderful. Wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. No, it's I'm grateful for how many people have come to the books that might not otherwise have done so, but the cost is pretty steep, in terms of the experience and how it has impacted readers, both first time and long time. But that would be another episode, wouldn't it?
It would. And it is true that the book remains, as Tolkien said, inviolable. So it will endure.
Inviolate,
but was it inviolate? Yeah,
I think it was inviolate, and I actually think it was a letter from the publisher to Tolkien, because you're thinking about the same letter I am, where they were both going back and forth about.
Maybe so. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember. It was.
But there definitely something to the effect of the book will always
the book will remain inviolate.
The book will be there.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Good stuff.
So,
well, Dr. Flieger, thank you so much for joining us. I can't tell you how much we appreciate it. It has been such a pleasure. And the fact that you've been more generous with your time than our listeners know, because you were with us for at least a half hour the other day. We have truly enjoyed our conversation with you, and you have a standing invitation to join us again anytime. Just let us know if you have something you want to talk about.
I will surely do that, because I've had a really good time. I've enjoyed it. I think you're very good interrogators. I like the questions.
Good. I'm glad
we do
to hear
try.
That.
We do try, and we thank you very much. As much as I hate to say it, I think that does wrap it up for this episode.
We did it.
And
we did.
And it also wraps it up for season 2 of the Prancing Pony Podcast, doesn't it, Alan?
That's right, folks. This is our last episode before we take a brief hiatus. We will be back in mid-August with episode 91 and an interview with Dr. Tom Shippey.
We'll be talking to him about the road to Middle-earth and J.R.R. Tolkien, author of The Century, as well as a little bit of non-Tolkien medievalism in his newest book, Laughing Shall I Die? Lives and Deaths of the Great Vikings. All that and the start of The Lord of the Rings after the break.
I get to read more about Vikings. I love that. But while we're off, we will still be around on social media. Bartleman will still be bringing us the mail, maybe a little late. He does that. And most importantly, we'll still be working on several things related to the podcast, all with an eye towards making things even better in season 3.
Yeah, but that's going to give us a chance to prepare for the upcoming season as thoroughly as we can.
Sure.
And we plan to do that after every season from here on out. Because we've got to keep it fresh and interesting. And that means sometimes even Alan and I need a break.
Oh, well, yeah, you're right. Well, if you have any questions about our hiatus or about season 3 or anything else along those lines, just let us know on social media or by emailing bartleman@theprancingponypodcast.com.
And while we're not going to ask you for anything, if you'd like to see how we're doing towards our Patreon goals, you can see them at patreon.com/prancingponypod.
That's right. We've asked you for stuff all along, and we're giving that a rest for a while. But we do want to give a very special shout out to our patrons at the Keir Dance contribution tier: DeMay in Alaska, James in Virginia, Tamsin in Minnesota, Don in Vancouver Island, and Emily in Texas. Thank you very much.
Thank you all so much for your support and for the time you spend listening, participating, and making our podcast better.
Well, and folks, that almost wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. As always, thank you very much for joining us. And while you're waiting for season 3, we invite you to please check out the official library tab on our website, theprancingponypodcast.com. We have links to everything from inexpensive paperbacks, perfect for taking notes, to some really good stuff for your Tolkien collection, including some of the books we've discussed here today with Dr. Flieger.
And if you wouldn't mind heading over to iTunes for us and leaving a review, we'd really appreciate that. It helps us find new listeners, and that means more great questions for Barliman, more discussion on social media, and all those things that make the Prancing Pony Podcast community great.
And thank you to those of you who have, by the way. Not only do we still read every one of them, but we are also featuring one a week on our social media networks on #Thankful Thursdays. Now make sure you never miss an episode of the show. Subscribe to the Prancing Pony Podcast through iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app.
And thank you to all of those who become part of our social media circles. We set out to start a Tolkien conversation that everyone could join, and that's why we have the online common room on Facebook at the Prancing Pony Podcast, on Twitter at Prancing Pony Pod, and on Instagram at Prancing Pony Pod.
And one last thing as always, don't forget to send your thoughts, comments, and most of all, your stories from the Bodleian Libraries. I was going to say pictures, but they are not allowing that, are they? Anyway, send them to barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com. We'll try to get them into our next episode. Folks, however much time we've had, hour and a half or so, still far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time,
farewell, friends.